I'm Hannah Lawson, 31 years old, and until that morning, I believed my family was just quietly dysfunctional. Nothing out of the ordinary. But standing at the polished oak podium inside St. Andrew's Church, my hands shaking against the cool wood, I realized how wrong I'd been. The air was thick with lilies and candle wax, the kind of scent that clings to memory long after a funeral ends. My grandmother's casket rested before the altar draped in white roses, while my parents sat in the front pew with dry eyes and perfect posture. My sister Caroline tilted her chin slightly, her expression carved into something between pity and suspicion. I took a deep breath, glanced down at my trembling note cards, and began the speech that would unknowingly set everything in motion. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever stood in front of your family and wondered when they'd finally see you for who you truly are. I grew up in a house that looked perfect, from the sidewalk, fresh paint, trimmed hedges, and curtains that always matched the season. Inside, though, love came in quiet, measured doses. My father was the kind of man who checked his watch during dinner conversations, and my mother believed appearances mattered more than honesty. Caroline learned early how to sparkle under their attention: ballet recitals, debate trophies, carefully curated smiles. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the child who loved the library more than the spotlight. Grandma Eleanor used to say I had an archivist's heart, that I noticed things others missed. Back then, I thought she was just being kind. I didn't know it meant she saw something in me my parents never did. Eleanor's home was my refuge. Her kitchen always smelled of cinnamon and wood polish, and her voice carried the kind of calm that could steady an entire room. She believed in doing small things with care, writing birthday cards by hand, remembering her neighbor's favorite pies, saving newspaper clippings she thought I'd enjoy. When I was 10, she taught me how to bake oatmeal raisin cookies, insisting that love wasn't always about what tasted sweetest, but about what mattered to someone else. I never forgot that. She lived her life that way, steady, thoughtful, and unshakably kind. By contrast, our family gatherings often felt like competitions. My parents measured success in degrees and salaries, and Caroline was their masterpiece. When I took a modest job at the public library after graduate school, my father's smile tightened with polite disappointment. My mother suggested I aim higher next time. The only person who never asked me to change was Grandma. She'd visit the library on quiet afternoons, sitting near the window while I helped patrons. "You make people feel seen, Hannah," she'd tell me as we shelved books together. "That's rarer than people realize." When she passed, I thought the grief would come in waves. Instead, it arrived as silence, a hollow space I couldn't fill. At the funeral, I tried to honor her memory with a story about those oatmeal cookies, about how she taught me that love lives in ordinary gestures. The words came easier than I expected, maybe because I was speaking to her, not to the rows of skeptical faces staring back. When I stepped down from the podium, a few people wiped their eyes, but my sister's expression didn't change. Caroline's lips curved into a faint smirk, like she knew something I didn't. After the service, I slipped away to the church basement where the reception was held. The smell of coffee and floor polish lingered in the air. Relatives swapped stories near the buffet tables, their laughter mingling with the clatter of serving spoons. I leaned against the cool cinder-block wall, grateful for the solitude. That's when a tall man in a charcoal suit approached, steady-gaze leather portfolio in hand. "Miss Lawson," he said, "I'm Michael Grant, your grandmother's attorney. My condolences." His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that carried weight even in a whisper. He offered to meet with me the next morning about matters concerning your grandmother's estate. Before I could respond, Caroline appeared, her black dress flawless, not a hair out of place. "What's this about?" she demanded, her tone sharp enough to draw stares from across the room. Michael replied with professional courtesy, saying he needed to speak with me privately. Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Why you?" she pressed. I was closer to Grandma than anyone. My parents drifted closer, their curiosity barely disguised behind polite smiles. "It's probably just paperwork," I said, surprised by how firm my voice sounded. Michael nodded, handing me his card before walking away. Caroline's stare followed him, then me, her suspicion thick as smoke. I thought the tension would fade once I got home, but it didn't. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the conversation in my mind. Why did he need to see me alone? Why now when Grandma was barely in the ground? The next morning I arrived early at his office on Broadway, a restored Victorian with polished wood and quiet grandeur. The air smelled faintly of lemon and leather, and the ticking of a grandfather clock filled the silence. My palms were damp against my skirt as I waited, every tick marking another unanswered question. When Michael finally emerged, he gave me a reassuring smile. "Thank you for coming, Miss Lawson," he said. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions." Something in his tone told me my world was about to shift in ways I couldn't imagine. As I followed him into his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grandma Eleanor had planned something my family wasn't going to like. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if being the quiet one was about to make me the most dangerous person in the room. Michael's office felt more like an old study than a workplace, mahogany shelves stacked with legal volumes, sunlight filtering through leaded glass, and the faint scent of lemon polish in the air. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, each sound tightening the space between my breaths. I sat across from his desk, the navy fabric of my skirt brushing against my knees, and tried to keep my hands still in my lap. Michael closed the door behind him, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. "I imagine this feels unusual," he said, gently taking a seat. "Your grandmother planned things with great care. She left instructions for how today should go." He placed a large manila folder on the desk, sliding it toward me. The sight of my grandmother's handwriting on the label made my throat tighten. "This," he said, "is her final will and testament executed 6 months ago." His tone was measured, but the words seemed to echo in the quiet room. I leaned forward, catching sight of my name typed near the top of the document. For a moment I didn't understand what I was reading. My name appeared again, then again, followed by a number $3 million in total assets. Michael paused to let the meaning settle. "Eleanor Lawson left her entire estate to you, Hannah. The house on Magnolia Street, all accounts, investments, and personal belongings." The sentence landed like a physical blow. "That can't be right," I said softly. "My parents—" "Caroline," she always said. My voice trailed off. Michael met my eyes, steady and patient. "I assure you it's accurate. Your grandmother was of sound mind when she made these decisions. She also anticipated this might come as a shock." He opened another folder, this one thicker, and filled with handwritten pages. Each sheet bore my grandmother's familiar looping script. Over the last 5 years, Eleanor kept meticulous records of family visits, he explained. She tracked when people came to see her, and more importantly, why. He turned the pages toward me, columns of dates, names, and notes. Caroline's name appeared again and again beside dollar amounts, requested money for tuition, asked for help with car payment, needed funds for trip abroad. My parents' names filled other lines marked by words like loan mortgage and repairs. Then in smaller handwriting, my name appeared. Next to it, no numbers. Just short notes brought books, fixed loose hinge shared coffee and conversation. I stared at the list until the lines blurred. "She was keeping score," I whispered. "Not score," Michael corrected gently. "Record." She wanted clarity. She wanted the truth to speak for itself when she was no longer here. He reached for another document, medical evaluations from 2 doctors. These confirmed she was completely competent. She took these steps to ensure her wishes would be honored. The air felt heavier with every passing minute. I thought about the countless times Caroline had boasted about how close she was to Grandma, how she'd been the favorite. My parents had always encouraged that illusion, their pride tied to Caroline's charm. I had accepted it as part of the family rhythm, my role quiet and forgettable, hers shining and admired. But now, the evidence on the table told a different story, one that made the years of being overlooked feel both painful and strangely vindicating. Michael folded his hands. "Eleanor also asked me to be transparent with you about your family's situation. It may help you understand what's coming." He revealed another file, this one filled with bank statements and mortgage documents. "Your parents refinanced their home 3 years ago. They're carrying significant debt. Your sister's lifestyle appears ambitious." He slid across a printed page of Caroline's public social posts, photos of designer clothes, rooftop brunches, and European vacations. They were depending on this inheritance, he said. It was never seen as a possibility, it was a certainty. I sat back, the chair creaking softly beneath me. My parents' casual comments over the past year suddenly made sense. Their nervous laughter about finally getting ahead, their hints about renovations and travel plans. They'd been planning a future that wasn't theirs to claim. Michael studied me quietly. Your grandmother wanted you to be prepared. She expected resistance. I nodded slowly. They're going to contest it. The words came out as fact, not fear. They will, he agreed, but she prepared for that too. He gestured toward the evidence on his desk. Witnesses, records, evaluations. Mr. Bennett next door served as one of 2 witnesses. He's already confirmed his willingness to testify. The clock in the corner chimed the hour. It felt like a signal marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. I glanced down at my grandmother's signature, strong and steady despite her age. She had built a wall of truth around me before she died, a final act of protection from the people who had never truly seen me. When I left the office, the sunlight outside felt harsh, almost unreal. My parents' house wasn't far, and I knew the moment I pulled into the driveway, word would already be spreading. As I stepped out of the car, I saw Caroline standing at the top of the porch steps, arms crossed. "You were with Grandma's lawyer this morning," she said, her tone already sharp. "What did he want with you paperwork?" I replied, keeping my voice even. "He said he'd reach out to the family soon." Her eyes narrowed. "He met with you first." "That's interesting." My parents appeared in the doorway behind her. My father's brow furrowed my mother's smile, too controlled. "Come inside," she said, "we should talk." The living room looked exactly as it always had, immaculate, expensive, cold. My mother sat with perfect posture on the edge of the couch, while my father stood near the window, glancing at his watch. Caroline dropped onto the armchair, tapping one manicured nail against the glass coffee table. "Let's not pretend nothing's happening," she said. "What did Grandma leave?" I hesitated. "It's complicated." "Complicated," she repeated with a scoff. "She had 1 house, 2 cars, and a retirement fund. How complicated can it be?" My father's voice cut in, measured but tense. "Michael Grant called us years ago when she updated her will, said everything was in order. So why would he contact you first?" I looked between them, realizing that no answer would satisfy them. "Maybe she trusted me with the initial paperwork," I said. "We'll know soon enough." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your grandmother was 91. She wasn't herself at the end. We'll need to make sure everything is appropriate." Caroline stood, arms folded. "If you think you're keeping anything from us, Hannah, you're mistaken." I felt the familiar urge to shrink back, to smooth over tension with apology. Instead, I gathered my purse, slipping Michael's card inside the inner pocket. "I'm sure Mr. Grant will contact you," I said quietly. "Until then, there's nothing more to discuss." I stepped outside before they could respond. The evening air carried the faint scent of gardenias from my mother's carefully arranged flower beds. For years I'd thought of that house as the center of everything safety family belonging. But as I walked down the driveway, I realized it had never really felt like home. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's handwriting, the careful loops, the notes beside my name. She had seen me. Through all the years of silence and comparison, she had noticed the small things that no one else did. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, growing cold between my hands. My phone buzzed on the counter, Caroline's name flashing across the screen. I didn't answer. A second later, a text appeared. "Whatever this is, we're not letting you take it." I turned the phone face down and stared out the window as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops. The world outside carried on like nothing had changed, but everything in my life had been rewritten overnight. Tomorrow would bring questions, accusations, maybe even threats. But for now, I held on to one quiet certainty. Grandma Eleanor had trusted me for a reason. And whether I liked it or not, it was time to find out why. The morning light spread across my kitchen table, catching the edge of the envelope Michael had given me. His card rested beside it, corners aligned with the kind of precision he seemed to live by. I'd barely slept, and when I finally did, my dreams blurred into fragments of conversations. I'd never had my grandmother's voice mixed with my sister's accusations. By the time I arrived at work, my stomach felt tight, the kind of tension that lingers behind polite smiles. Margaret met me near the circulation desk, her silver hair pulled back neatly as always. "Rough week," she asked quietly, following me into my office. I nodded, setting my bag down. More complicated than I expected. She waited for me to say more, but when I didn't, she gave a reassuring pat on my shoulder. Whatever it is, don't let it shake your ground. You've handled worse storms than you think. I almost believed her. By lunchtime, the whispers had started. A friend from church messaged me to ask if everything was all right with my family. I hadn't posted anything, hadn't said a word to anyone beyond work, so the question hit me wrong. I opened my phone and saw what she meant. Caroline's social media feed was full of comments from mutual acquaintances, her words written with practiced charm but sharp beneath the surface. Some people will do anything for money, she'd written, even twist the memory of someone who loved them. The post had hundreds of likes already. My heart dropped. It wasn't just gossip, it was strategy. She'd framed herself as the grieving granddaughter and me as the manipulative one. Every photo she posted painted her version of truth, smiling with Grandma at birthdays, holding her hand at the nursing home, all carefully cropped to look intimate. The comments beneath were full of sympathy. "So sorry, Caroline. Money changes people. Your grandma would be proud of you for standing up." Each word pressed deeper, as if strangers were writing over the life I'd actually lived. I shut my office door and called Michael. "It's already started," I said, my voice low. "She's turning people against me." He listened without interrupting. "Forward me everything," he instructed. "Do not respond, not even privately. We'll handle this through documentation." His tone was calm, but I could hear the edge beneath it. "They'll try to get a reaction. Don't give them one." That evening, I drove home through streets that looked suddenly unfamiliar. My phone buzzed every few minutes, texts from distant relatives, acquaintances, even one from my father. "Split the inheritance evenly, and this ends. Think about what you're doing to our family." The words made my fingers tighten around the steering wheel. I didn't reply. The silence felt heavier than any argument. At home, I found Harold Bennett waiting on my porch. He held a paper bag in one hand, smelling faintly of cinnamon rolls. "Thought you could use some breakfast for tomorrow," he said when I opened the door. His presence steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. Inside, he set the bag on the table, pulling out a small notebook from his jacket. "Your grandmother gave me copies of her records," he explained. "Said if anything ever happened, these might help you understand." The pages were filled with her tidy handwriting, dates, details of visits, small observations written without judgment. Caroline visited after loan request. Hannah brought garden clippings and tea. No financial discussion. Harold closed the notebook carefully. Eleanor knew this would happen. She didn't want bitterness, but she wanted fairness. His eyes softened. "She told me once that love without boundaries isn't love at all." I nodded, grateful for the quiet understanding between us. Over the next few days, the tension built. My parents stopped returning my calls, and Caroline's posts became more pointed. At work, a few coworkers gave me curious looks, and one patron whispered something I pretended not to hear. Margaret caught my expression and offered a gentle word. "People believe what's loudest," she said. "Stay steady. The truth will hold." Michael called late one afternoon. "We have a hearing date," he said. 2 weeks. I felt the floor tilt slightly. "They're contesting the will." "Yes," he confirmed. "Undue influence. They're claiming you manipulated your grandmother." The words sounded absurd, but the sting of them still landed. "We'll counter it," he added. "Your grandmother documented everything. I've already spoken with her doctor and Harold. We're prepared." That night, I gathered every piece of evidence Michael had asked for: text messages, photos, notes. My dining table looked like an archive of the past 5 years. I handled each document carefully, not just as proof, but as a record of who my grandmother truly was. The small details told the truth. Grocery receipts, handwritten recipes, notes tucked into birthday cards. Each one painted a picture no rumor could erase. A message popped up on my phone. "Caroline again. Meet me tomorrow at the library. We need to talk." The words felt more like a demand than a request. I didn't reply, but I knew she'd come either way. The next morning, she appeared at the reference desk wearing a crisp blazer and that same practiced smile. "Hannah," she said brightly, "can we speak somewhere private?" Her voice carried just enough to make nearby patrons glance up. I gestured toward the staff office, keeping my tone polite. Once the door closed, the mask dropped. "You're making a fool of yourself," she hissed. Mom and Dad are furious. You think you can just steal everything and walk away clean? It's not stealing, I said evenly. Grandma made her choice. She was confused, Caroline snapped. You filled her head with lies while she was sick. Her voice rose and I glanced at the glass wall that faced the main floor. Lower your voice, I said. You're in a public building. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing. You always hide behind quiet rooms and polite words. Maybe that worked with Grandma, but it won't work here. I stood opening the door. We're done. She hesitated, realizing she'd drawn attention. Her expression flickered anger, giving way to something colder. This isn't over, she said before storming out. I closed the door and leaned against it, my pulse steady, but my hands trembling. When I finally sat down, Margaret appeared with 2 cups of coffee. I heard her, she said, simply setting one on my desk. Document it, every encounter. By the time I left work that evening, I'd written a full account for Michael, complete with timestamps and witness names. He called after reading it. You handled that perfectly, he said. Every word she speaks in public only helps our case. Still, the nights grew longer. The weight of it all pressed down like humidity before a storm. I kept to my routines, work home late evenings, sorting files, but underneath the quiet rhythm was a slow burn of disbelief. How easily family could twist love into leverage. One evening as I was organizing papers, a new email arrived from Michael. We've confirmed the medical testimony and secured your grandmother's doctor as a witness. Focus on your work. We'll handle the noise. I read it twice before closing my laptop. The following morning, Margaret brought me another envelope, character references from coworkers, even a note from the library director. Their words were simple, steady, genuine. It was a small kindness, but it carried weight. Not everyone believed the story Caroline was spreading. Some people still trusted what they'd seen for themselves. As I locked up that night, I paused near the library's front doors. Through the glass, the city lights flickered faintly against the sky. Somewhere beyond them, my family was preparing for a battle I hadn't chosen, but I wasn't the same person who used to shrink from their disapproval. Grandma's faith in me had left something stronger behind. I turned off the lights and stepped outside the cool evening air, brushing against my face. The courthouse date was set. The noise was growing louder, and for the first time in my life, I didn't plan on stepping out of the way. By the end of the week, Michael's office looked less like a law firm and more like a command center. Every inch of the polished conference table was covered with folders, binders, and notes marked in his neat handwriting. He worked quietly deliberate in each movement, while I sat across from him reviewing witness statements. The tension between focus and fatigue hung in the air, neither of us speaking more than necessary. When he finally looked up from a document, his voice was calm but steady. Your grandmother gave us everything we need, he said. Now it's just a matter of preparation. I nodded, my eyes tracing the edges of a thick binder filled with her journals and correspondence. The more I read, the more I realized how carefully she had planned this. Eleanor had spent her last years documenting not just events but patterns, the times my family visited, the timing of their requests, the reasons for their sudden interest. There were even notes about the tone of each conversation. She knew exactly how this would unfold, I said quietly. Michael gave a slight nod. She did. She also trusted you to see it through. Harold arrived just before noon, carrying a small cardboard box. Found these in my garage, he said, setting it down with a soft thud. Inside were stacks of birthday cards, all written by my grandmother, in her familiar cursive. She always mentioned you, Hannah. Said you had her patience, but not her temper. He chuckled, easing into a chair beside me. Michael examined one of the cards, his lawyer's precision giving way to something almost tender. These help, he said. They show consistent affection and intent. That's more powerful than people realize. We worked for hours building timelines, pairing records with testimony, matching each accusation we expected with proof of truth. My head ached from reading, but there was something steadying about the work itself. For years, I had avoided confrontation, smoothing tension before it grew sharp. Now every document I touched felt like a small act of defiance. The quiet librarian was learning how to fight back with facts, not fury. Late that afternoon, the office phone buzzed. Michael answered, listening carefully before nodding. That was the courthouse, he said after hanging up. The probate hearing's confirmed for 2 weeks from Thursday. I felt the words settle like weight on my shoulders. 2 weeks to prove my grandmother's intentions, 2 weeks before my family's anger became official. "We'll be ready," Michael said firmly. "But we need to anticipate how they'll attack." We went through each likely claim one by one: undue influence, diminished capacity, emotional manipulation. Each theory came with counter-evidence medical evaluations, witness statements, logs from the nursing home, even recorded phone calls showing Eleanor's independence. "They'll say you isolated her," Michael said. "We'll show that she invited you, that she had visitors she chose to see." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Perception matters as much as proof. Keep your composure. No public statements, no engagement online." I thought of Caroline's latest post photos of her crying on the courthouse steps, paired with captions about betrayal and family loyalty. The comments were full of sympathy from people who'd never met me. "She's building a story," I said. "Let her," Michael replied. "Stories without evidence collapse eventually." Over the next several days, my home turned into an extension of his office. Folders covered my dining table, each labeled by topic: financial records, witnesses, timeline of visits. Margaret stopped by with dinner one night, setting down a casserole dish still warm from the oven. "You can't fight on an empty stomach," she said simply. She stayed for a few minutes listening as I walked her through the details of the upcoming hearing. "It's a lot," she said softly, "but you're handling it with grace." The following morning, I woke to find a text from Caroline. "Meet me at the house. We need to talk face to face." Against my better judgment, I drove to the address I'd known my entire life. My parents' home looked the same meticulously kept lawn rose bushes trimmed to perfection, but the moment I stepped inside, the air was heavy. My father stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. My mother sat at the dining table, posture rigid. Caroline waited in the center of the room, her voice sharp before I even spoke. "You could stop all this," she said. "Just agree to divide things fairly." "Grandma didn't want it divided," I said. "You know that," she scoffed. "You think you earned it?" "She pitied you, Hannah. You were a charity case." My mother flinched but didn't intervene. My father's jaw tightened. "We're giving you a chance to do the right thing," he said, "before this gets uglier than it already is." I met his eyes. "You're threatening me." He hesitated. "We're protecting the family name." I turned to leave, but Caroline's voice followed me. "When this is over, you'll wish you'd shared." The words hung in the air as I walked out the door. That evening I sat at my desk drafting notes about the confrontation. Every detail mattered: the time, the tone, the witnesses who might have overheard. Michael called just as I finished. "They're escalating," he said after I described the exchange. "Good. It shows motive." He paused, his voice softening. "I know this isn't easy, Hannah, but you're doing exactly what you should." The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Harold and I met with Michael twice more, refining testimony and cross-references. He read every statement aloud until the rhythm felt natural. "Stick to what you know," he reminded us. "Truth carries its own weight." One night I stayed late at the office reviewing files under the soft hum of the desk lamp. I found a note my grandmother had written to herself on a scrap of paper tucked inside one of her journals. "Fairness doesn't always make everyone happy, but it makes peace possible." I read it 3 times before setting it aside. By the end of the second week, every document was in order, every witness prepared. The evidence told a clear story, one of love freely given, not bought or demanded. Michael leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "This is airtight," he said. "They can argue, but they can't undo facts." When I left his office that evening, the city lights of San Antonio shimmered across the windows of parked cars. For the first time in months, I felt something close to calm. The storm was coming, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. My grandmother had taught me that strength didn't always roar. It could also live in quiet persistence. The next morning, as I locked my apartment door, a soft knock echoed from the hallway. Harold stood there, cane in hand, wearing his usual cardigan and a kind but serious expression. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. "As I'll ever be." He smiled faintly. "Good. Then let's go make her proud." Together we walked toward the elevator, the steady rhythm of his cane against the tile matching the quiet certainty in my chest. The courthouse waited, and so did the truth my grandmother had spent her final years protecting. The morning before the hearing, I stood in my kitchen staring at a table buried in papers. Medical reports, witness statements, and receipts filled every inch each document. Another piece of my grandmother's quiet defense. Harold sat across from me, glasses perched low on his nose as he organized a handwritten timeline. "Every time your sister visited, it was right after she needed something," he murmured. His pen tapped the page rhythmically. "Vacations, car repairs, tuition. It's all right here." Margaret arrived a few minutes later carrying a stack of sealed envelopes. "These are the character references," she said, setting them down. 5 from the library, 2 from community partners. They all speak to your integrity." She poured herself a cup of coffee, then looked at me carefully. "You don't need to convince anyone of who you are. Just show them what's true." Her voice had that calm certainty that could steady anyone. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Caroline lit the screen. "You still have time to fix this. Split the inheritance and the rest disappears." I turned the phone face down and took a slow breath. "She won't stop," Margaret said softly. "No," I answered. "She won't." Later that day, I met Michael at his office. The conference room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner. He laid out the legal strategy like a teacher reviewing a well-worn lesson plan. "They'll argue undue influence," he said. "We'll counter with medical evidence testimony and consistent patterns of behavior." He pointed to a stack of folders. "Dr. Brooks will testify first. His evaluations confirm Eleanor's cognitive health right up to the end." He flipped another folder open. Inside were copies of visitor logs from the nursing home. My name filled the pages week after week. My families appeared rarely clustered around holidays and expense dates. "This is the backbone," he said. "Facts that speak louder than emotion." He studied my expression for a moment. "You're handling this better than most." "I've had practice being quiet," I said. He smiled faintly. "Quiet is different from weak. Don't forget that." We spent the next few hours rehearsing questions and reviewing potential surprises. Michael believed in preparation, more than luck. When we finished, the table looked like a battlefield mapped in ink and paper. "Get some rest," he said, standing. "Tomorrow won't be easy, but we're ready." That night, sleep felt distant. I walked through my apartment, straightening stacks of paper and setting out the navy suit I planned to wear. The same one I'd worn at Grandma's funeral. I checked my reflection in the mirror before turning off the lights. The woman looking back didn't seem frightened, just steady. The following morning, the courthouse smelled faintly of wood polish and old air. Michael and I arrived early, followed soon after by Harold, walking with his cane, but still upright and sure. "Morning, Miss Hannah," he said with a nod. His presence filled the room with quiet dignity. Eleanor would have been proud. When my family entered, the air shifted. My father's suit was pressed to perfection, my mother's pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and Caroline's heels clicked sharply across the tile. They avoided my eyes but made certain everyone else saw their composure. Michael leaned closer. "They'll play the part of the concerned family. Don't react." The bailiff called the courtroom to order. The opposing attorney, a gray-haired man named Robert Thornton, began his opening statement. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind meant to sound reasonable, even while twisting the truth. "This is not about greed," he told the judge. "It's about ensuring the final wishes of a beloved matriarch were not manipulated by undue influence." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a dry tissue. Caroline stared straight ahead, her expression carefully arranged. When it was Michael's turn, his tone stayed calm and deliberate. "The petitioner paints a picture of influence. What we will show is intention recorded, witnessed, and documented by Mrs. Lawson herself." He walked to the evidence table and lifted a binder. "Every visit, every request, every act of care is accounted for. This is not speculation. It's fact." The first witness was Dr. Brooks. His testimony was clear and unwavering. "Mrs. Lawson remained mentally sharp until her passing," he said. "She understood every legal document she signed." Thornton tried to suggest confusion, but Dr. Brooks never wavered. "I've treated patients for 40 years, he said calmly. Eleanor Lawson was one of the most lucid among them. Next came Harold. He walked slowly to the stand, the soft click of his cane marking each step. "I lived next door to Eleanor for 3 decades, he said. We played chess every Thursday, right up until the week she died. Thornton asked if Eleanor ever seemed pressured by family. Harold shook his head. Only by the ones asking for money, he said simply. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Then came my turn. Michael gave a slight nod as I took the stand. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my voice stayed even. He guided me through each question, how often I visited, what we talked about, the things I did for her. "Did your grandmother ever discuss her will with you?" he asked. "Not until the very end," I said, and even then she only told me she wanted to make sure her wishes were clear. Thornton's cross-examination came next. His tone was smooth, but sharp underneath. "Miss Lawson, isn't it true you were at your grandmother's home more frequently than anyone else?" "Yes. And during those visits, you had access to her personal papers. She trusted me to help organize them." He paced slowly. "So you admit you were alone with her documents?" "I admit I respected her privacy," I said evenly. "She told me what to file and what to leave alone." He paused, studying me. "You never once discussed the will." "No," I said. "She didn't need my opinion." He hesitated, then nodded curtly. "No further questions." When I stepped down, my legs felt heavy but steady. Michael gave me a small nod of approval as I returned to my seat. By the time the session adjourned for lunch, my parents avoided looking at me. Caroline's expression had hardened into something brittle. Outside the courtroom, Margaret was waiting near the hallway bench. She handed me a bottle of water and a soft smile. "You did fine," she said. "Better than fine." After lunch, Michael presented the journals. He read a few selected entries aloud, Eleanor's words echoing softly through the room. Robert asked about the lake house again. Caroline needed tuition. Hannah brought soup and fixed the kitchen cabinet. No requests, just company. The courtroom fell silent. When Thornton tried to object, the judge overruled him. "Continue, Mr. Grant," she said. Michael closed the journal and spoke calmly. "Mrs. Lawson made these notes to preserve clarity, not to accuse anyone, but they leave little doubt about her intent. By the end of the day, even the judge's questions leaned toward skepticism of my family's claims." My mother's voice cracked under cross-examination, and my father's answers grew defensive. Caroline's composure faltered when confronted with financial records tied to her visits. As the judge called for recess, Michael gathered his papers. "We'll finish tomorrow," he said quietly. "But I think the worst has passed." I exhaled the first full breath I'd taken all day. Outside, the afternoon light softened against the courthouse steps. Harold joined me as we walked toward the car. "You kept your calm," he said. "That's how she would have done it." I nodded, the tension finally beginning to ease. The truth had begun to speak for itself, just as Grandma knew it would. Still, I sensed it wasn't over, not yet. The final decision was coming, and everything my grandmother had worked for depended on what the judge would say next. The second day of the hearing began under a gray morning sky, the kind that made the courthouse steps glisten faintly with dew. Michael and I arrived early again, both of us carrying that same quiet focus we'd found the day before. The hallways were almost silent except for the soft click of shoes and the hum of the air vents. Harold waited near the benches, cane resting across his knees, and gave me a nod as we passed. "Almost there," he said softly. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavier than before. My family sat across the aisle, their expressions carefully composed. My father's jaw was set, my mother's pearl earrings glinted beneath the lights, and Caroline stared straight ahead, her face unreadable. She didn't look at me, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. When the session began, Thornton rose first. His tone was practiced and polite, but every word carried quiet accusation. "Your Honor," he began, "we intend to show that Mrs. Lawson's will was the product of subtle manipulation, affection used as leverage, loyalty disguised as control." He turned slightly toward me. "Even the most well-meaning granddaughter can unintentionally influence an elderly relative's judgment." Michael waited until Thornton sat down before standing. His voice carried calm authority, steady but firm. "Your Honor, affection isn't influence. It's the absence of motive. Mrs. Lawson recorded her reasoning herself, her visits, her notes, her own words. They speak more clearly than any accusation." He placed a small stack of bound journals on the evidence table and returned to his seat without another word. The first witness that morning was one of my grandmother's nurses from the retirement home, a kind woman named Denise Clark. She described Eleanor as sharp and opinionated even in her final months. She ran the book club, Denise said with a small smile. And she corrected me on crossword answers. That woman knew exactly what she wanted. Thornton tried to suggest that age had softened her judgment, but Denise stood her ground. She might have slowed down a little, she said, but her mind never did. Then Harold took the stand again, this time for cross-examination. Thornton leaned forward, adopting a gentler tone. "Mr. Bennett, you were quite fond of Mrs. Lawson, weren't you?" "Yes," Harold replied evenly. "And fond of her granddaughter as well. I respect her," Harold said. "Same way I respected her grandmother." Thornton paused as if weighing how far to push. "Would you say that your fondness for Hannah might make your perspective biased?" Harold's expression didn't change. "No, sir," he said. "I'm old enough to know the difference between kindness and corruption." The courtroom murmured softly before the judge's gavel restored silence. When it was my turn again, I felt the same quiet steadiness I'd carried since yesterday. Thornton's tone was smooth, almost conversational. "Miss Lawson, you've portrayed yourself as a devoted granddaughter. Yet you stood to gain everything from this will. Isn't that a convenient coincidence?" "It wasn't convenient," I said. "It was my grandmother's choice." He smiled faintly as if humoring a child. "You never once discussed her finances with her, never. No mention of property accounts or inheritances. She didn't need my advice." Thornton's pen tapped the desk. "And yet she gave you $3 million. I held his gaze. She gave me what she thought was right. He waited for me to falter, but the silence stayed still between us. Finally, he looked toward the judge. No further questions. When I stepped down, Michael met my eyes with a look that said more than words could. His next move came swiftly. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to call one final witness, Dr. Samuel Brooks." The doctor took the stand, his white hair neatly combed, his manner calm and precise. He'd been my grandmother's physician for more than 20 years. Mrs. Lawson requested mental evaluations every 6 months after her 85th birthday, he testified. She wanted documentation confirming her cognitive health. "Why?" Michael asked. Dr. Brooks adjusted his glasses. She anticipated potential disputes. She once told me, "Clarity today avoids chaos tomorrow." He smiled faintly at the memory. Her last evaluation was 3 months before her death. The results showed no impairment of memory judgment or reasoning. Thornton tried to challenge the findings, but Dr. Brooks remained unshaken. "I conducted the exams myself," he said. She was as sharp as ever. By mid-afternoon, both sides had presented everything. Thornton made one final appeal, painting a picture of confusion and emotional dependence. "Family love," he said, "is powerful and sometimes dangerous. My clients only seek fairness." When Michael stood to deliver his closing, he didn't raise his voice. "Fairness isn't measured by equal portions," he said quietly. "It's measured by truth." Eleanor Lawson documented her own intentions not out of distrust, but out of wisdom. He opened one of her journals and read, "Love isn't about what people expect from you. It's about what you give without being asked." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge's expression softened. As Michael returned to our table, I felt the air shift around us. The arguments were finished. All that was left now was the waiting. The judge, a composed woman with silver hair and thoughtful eyes, glanced between both tables. "I'll review the evidence and issue my decision by tomorrow afternoon," she said. "Court is adjourned." Her gavel struck once sharp against the quiet room. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, throwing streaks of light across the courthouse lawn. Harold joined me on the steps, his cane tapping gently against the stone. "You spoke with strength," he said. "Your grandmother would have been proud." I nodded, feeling the fatigue settle deep in my shoulders. Michael stepped beside us, folding his notes neatly into his briefcase. "It's out of our hands now," he said. "But I'd be surprised if the outcome isn't what she intended." Caroline exited the building a few minutes later, walking between our parents. She stopped halfway down the steps, turning briefly toward me. For a fleeting second, her expression wasn't anger. It was something closer to disbelief, maybe even fear. Then she looked away and kept walking. Harold watched her go. "Some lessons come slow," he murmured. As the crowd dispersed, I stood for a moment longer, looking up at the courthouse windows. The glass reflected the bright sky, clear and steady. Tomorrow would decide more than money. It would decide the truth my grandmother had spent her life protecting. When I finally turned to leave, Michael gave a small nod. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll meet here in the morning." That night I couldn't sleep. The city outside my window buzzed with quiet noise. Cars passing, distant voices, the hum of late summer air. I sat by the window with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands, thinking of Eleanor's steady voice reading aloud from her journal. "The love we give without asking for return, that's the kind that lasts." Her words echoed softly in the stillness. By morning I would know if her lesson had finally taken root. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streamed across my living room floor, catching the edges of the folders I'd left on the coffee table. I'd been too restless to clean up after another night of pacing between the couch and the window. The city outside was still half asleep, but inside me everything was restless. Today the judge would deliver her decision. By the time I reached the courthouse, the air was already thick with humidity. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights as I walked down the long corridor toward the courtroom. Harold was waiting by the doors again, his cane leaning against the bench beside him. "Morning, Miss Hannah," he said, his voice steady as always. "You ready?" I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Michael joined us a few minutes later, briefcase in hand, his tie perfectly straight despite the heat. "No new motions," he said as we stepped inside. "That's a good sign." His calm presence was its own anchor. The courtroom filled slowly. My parents entered together, dressed in matching shades of navy, their expressions composed but tense. Caroline followed, glancing toward me once before taking her seat beside them. For a fleeting second, her face softened, then hardened again as Thornton whispered something in her ear. Judge Rowe entered right on time. Everyone rose, then sat again as she adjusted her glasses and looked over the thick stack of papers on her desk. The room went completely still. "I have reviewed all documentation, testimony, and exhibits related to the estate of the late Mrs. Eleanor Lawson," she began. Her voice was even measured, impossible to read. "This case presents a painful portrait of a family divided not by circumstance but by expectation." She paused, scanning the room before continuing. "The evidence shows that Mrs. Lawson maintained complete mental clarity in the years preceding her death. Her decision to leave her estate to her granddaughter, Miss Hannah Lawson, was deliberate, supported by detailed records, witness testimony, and professional evaluation." My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father's jaw tightened. Caroline sat motionless, her nails digging into the folder on her lap. For these reasons, the judge continued, "This court upholds the validity of the will as written. All assets and properties will transfer to Miss Lawson in accordance with her grandmother's instructions." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then Caroline shot to her feet. "That's not fair!" she shouted, her voice cracking through the stillness. She manipulated her. "Grandma would never." "Ms. Lawson," the judge interrupted sharply, "you will sit down or be held in contempt." Caroline froze. Her face flushed with disbelief, then dropped back into her chair, trembling with anger. Judge Rowe's expression softened, just slightly. "This court recognizes the emotional nature of these proceedings, but no one was coerced here, only revealed." Her gavel struck once. Case closed. The sound echoed through the room like a door slamming shut. My parents rose together without looking at me. My mother's eyes glistened, but whether from sorrow or humiliation I couldn't tell. My father muttered something to Thornton, then guided her toward the exit. Caroline lingered a moment longer, glaring at me before storming out. When the courtroom emptied, I stayed seated. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my hands folded in my lap, as though moving might break the spell. Michael closed his briefcase and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "You did it." Harold came forward, his eyes warm with relief. "Your grandmother knew what she was doing, Hannah," he said, patting my hand. "She'd be mighty proud." Outside, the sun had burned through the clouds, flooding the courthouse steps with light. The brightness stung my eyes, but it felt cleansing somehow. For months, my life had been filled with shadows, accusations, suspicion, half-truths, whispered in hallways. Now there was nothing left but clarity. Reporters waited near the street, murmuring among themselves, but none approached. I walked past them without slowing. The air smelled faintly of rain and asphalt. Behind me, Michael spoke briefly to Harold, then joined me at the bottom of the steps. "Everything's in motion now," he said. "Transfers, legal notices, property filings. It'll take a few weeks, but the estate is yours." The words still felt strange. The estate is yours. They carried weight, but not the kind I'd expected. I thought I'd feel triumph, maybe vindication. Instead, there was a quiet ache, the kind that follows a truth too long denied. As we walked toward the parking lot, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see Mrs. Gonzalez from my grandmother's old garden club approaching, clutching her sun hat against the wind. "Oh, Hannah," she said, her eyes shining. "Eleanor would be so happy today. She always said you understood her heart better than anyone." Her words were simple, but they cut straight through the noise that had surrounded me for months. I managed a small smile. She taught me everything that mattered. That evening, the news reached the community faster than I expected. Social media posts disappeared one by one. Caroline's, my mother's, even the veiled messages from their friends. In their place came quiet apologies from people who'd once believed them. Old neighbors stopped by the library to congratulate me. A few brought flowers, others just kind words. For the first time, their eyes held respect instead of pity. Margaret found me shelving returns in the back room and pulled me into a hug. "You handled all this with more grace than most could muster," she said. "Your grandmother raised a woman with her same backbone." Later that night, I walked home through the still air, carrying a small bouquet Mrs. Gonzalez had left on my desk. The streets glowed under the streetlights, soft and calm after the storm of the past months. When I reached my apartment, I placed the flowers beside Eleanor's framed photograph on the mantel. She was smiling in that picture, standing in her garden, with her sun hat tilted back. I whispered softly, "We did it, Grandma." The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the same quiet rhythm that had carried through the courthouse earlier that day. I thought of Caroline's face, the raw anger in her eyes, and for the first time I didn't feel fear or guilt, only a kind of gentle sadness for what she'd lost beyond the inheritance. Outside my window, the wind stirred the trees, scattering the last of the spring blossoms across the street. I watched the petals drift for a long while before turning out the light. Tomorrow would bring paperwork, bank forms, and official letters, but none of that mattered tonight. What mattered was that truth had finally held its ground, and that somewhere beyond everything, Eleanor Lawson's quiet wisdom had prevailed. 6 months passed before the world around me finally felt steady again. Summer had given way to crisp autumn mornings, and life in San Antonio had slipped back into a rhythm I hadn't realized I missed. I still worked at the public library, though my title had changed. The board had voted me in as head librarian just weeks after the court's ruling. Margaret had called it the most natural promotion in years, but it still felt surreal to hear my name in that meeting. I used part of the inheritance to pay off my student loans and to start something my grandmother once dreamed of, a small literacy foundation in her name. The Eleanor Lawson Trust funded after-school reading programs, senior book clubs, and workshops for adults learning to read for the first time. The first time I saw the plaque with her name engraved beneath mine, I couldn't hold back the tears. It wasn't about money or recognition. It was about carrying forward her belief that knowledge and kindness could still make quiet miracles happen. Harold became the foundation's first advisor. He stopped by the library every Tuesday, cane tapping in rhythm with his careful steps. Sometimes he brought old stories of my grandmother, how she'd taught neighbors to balance checkbooks, or how she once organized a food drive without telling a soul she was the one behind it. Listening to him always reminded me that her greatest legacy wasn't the estate she left behind, but the life she'd lived, simple, generous, and steady. One afternoon I was sorting donations when I saw Caroline standing in the doorway. For a moment I thought I'd imagined her. She looked different, smaller somehow, like the sharp edges she once carried had worn down. She held a small paper bag in her hands. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. We sat at one of the reading tables near the back. The silence between us was thick at first, the kind that carries too many memories. Then she took a deep breath. "I was angry," she said. "Not just about the will, about everything. You were always the quiet one, and somehow Grandma loved you more for it. I couldn't understand that." Her voice trembled. "I said things I can't take back." I didn't interrupt. I just listened the way Grandma once taught me to, when words mattered most. Caroline opened the bag and slid a small box across the table. Inside was a gold locket, Eleanor's, the one she used to wear every Sunday. "I found it in a drawer," she said. "It belongs with you." The metal was warm from her hands when I lifted it. Inside, 2 photos faced each other. One of my grandmother smiling wide in her garden, and one of us as children sitting on her porch steps covered in cookie dough and sunlight. I closed it gently and said, "She'd want us both to remember her this way." Caroline nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Maybe someday we can start over." "Someday," I said. And for the first time in years, I meant it. Life didn't transform overnight after that, but it did soften. My parents still kept their distance, though I occasionally received polite emails from my mother, recipes, neighborhood updates, small steps toward something less brittle. Maybe time would finish what the court couldn't repair. In November, I visited the cemetery on the edge of town. The trees were half bare, their leaves scattered across the path in shades of rust and gold. I carried a small bouquet of white roses, just like the ones that had covered her casket that spring. As I knelt beside her headstone, I told her about the foundation, the new programs, and the students who'd come through the library because of her name. I told her about Caroline's visit and the locket that now rested in my jewelry box. The air was still and cool. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the hour. I traced my fingers over the carved letters of her name and whispered, "You were right, Grandma. Real wealth doesn't sit in a bank. It lives in how we treat people, even when it costs us." When I stood, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, the light turning golden and soft. I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, the kind that settles deep and quiet inside the bones. That evening back home, I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window, the same spot where I'd once waited anxiously for the court's decision. Now the city lights outside shimmered like distant stars. I opened the locket again, running my thumb over the tiny photographs. It struck me that love in its truest form never really ends. It just changes shape, finding new ways to stay alive in us. I don't know what the future holds for my family. Maybe forgiveness, maybe distance, maybe something in between. But I do know that what my grandmother left me wasn't just an inheritance. It was a map, a way to live with dignity when others doubt you, to stand firm when truth is tested, and to keep loving quietly even when no one notices. So if you've ever been the one overlooked, the quiet one, the steady one, trust that someone sees you even when the world doesn't. And one day, that quiet strength will speak louder than any accusation ever could. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, take a moment to share it or just leave a thought about someone who shaped your life with kindness. I think my grandmother would have liked that.